Greetings everyone, welcome back, Six UK here, to volume 2 of games that I have played. And today I'm going to deal with a fairly well-known game. In fact, I'll be surprised if any of you haven't heard of it. Call of Cthulhu. Dun, dun, dun. For those that you don't know of it, and I'm surprised if there is any, Call of Cthulhu is a 1920s investigative horror RPG based on the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. It's been around, I think, since about 1980, and it is one of the best, maybe even one of the top-selling RPGs of all time. In this game, in its default setting, which is 1920s, you play everyday people. There's no we are superheroes. There's no AD&D style or D&D style over the top sort of heroes. You are a bog standard person. You have nothing special. You are nothing special. But you will investigate things that at first glance will appear paranormal, downright unbelievable. And eventually you will come to realise that the world you're living in is not the centre of the universe, and there are bigger and grimlier things out there. And that knowledge will either bolster you or drive you utterly insane. And the things you run into are probably going to kill you, unless you're very, very clever and lucky. Yes, it's all very nihilistic. It's good fun. As a system, it's nice and simple. You essentially have a set, I think it's about 9 stats. And although the current edition of the rules, you can point by them, the old school way of doing it, and what I much prefer, simply because you are a normal, everyday, non-superheroic person, is to roll the stats. And the stats are generally like 3d6 or 2d6 plus 6. And the general skill system is that you pick a profession. And the main rulebook has probably about a dozen. And it's things like private investigator, reporter, professor, antiquarian, accountant, lawyer. The sort of people that were the focus behind the stories in Lovecraft's work and are fairly stereotypical of like 1920s America. Each one of these has a set of skills, and the skill system is a D100 one. You may have something like 100 points to spend. Skills have a default value, you add on to that, and whenever you come to make a skill check, you simply roll a D100. If you get equal or less, it's a success, and you might need to compare how much you pass by in order to determine any sort of GM given degree of success. The game does. I forgot to mention, it's published by Chaosium, who and they pretty much use the same system for all of their games: RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu. I think they do a generic version called the Basic Universe Role Playing or something. I just realised that spells burps. Anyway. Essentially, the game is geared towards non-campaign play. You're pretty much running one-off scenarios, or maybe one or two with the same characters, because the game, if you run it by its default, is fairly lethal. Either in sanity, of which you have a stat to determine how insane your character is going, or in actual lethality, because a normal person running into a Shoggoth is not going to walk away from that encounter. There are a couple of campaigns that have been published, the best one of which is Masks of Nyarlathotep, which I fully recommend. I've run that about 4 times in the last 20 odd years. It's absolutely awesome. But the system hasn't changed, unlike D&D and a few others. Over that, nearly 40 odd years, the system has barely changed. I think the current edition is slightly different in there are some additions to the stats, sort of like critical ratings and successes and failures and things like that. But essentially, you could show this system to the modern system to somebody that started in 1980, and they would know exactly what was going on. It's the same system, unlike say D&D where they change it every 5 years, and you couldn't show D&D 5th to somebody from like the 1970s or early 80s and expect them to go, this is the same game. It's one of my bugbears in D&D. But Call of Cthulhu, it's the same system they've stuck with. It works, it's brilliant. So essentially the scenarios that you will play in Call of Cthulhu are investigative ones. Something will happen. Either you'll be approached by a family member or a work colleague or somebody to say that such and such has happened. You know, my son has disappeared, or I've inherited a haunted house on the edge of the woods. Would you please, as your more skilled person, could you investigate this for me? Blah blah blah. And you do so. For the most part, the scenarios work really well that they're published, and Chaosium have been really good over the years of publishing books of nothing but scenarios. A lot of the early scenarios were terrible. There's no arguing that. They were obviously written by people that had started playing D&D, and you can tell. You would have, say, a haunted house that had like a shoggoth in the basement, a ghoul in the parlour, something else in the attic, and it felt like someone had tried to do a D&D dungeon crawl scenario. So a lot of the very early scenarios are absolutely awful. Mid 80s is where it really, and late 80s really starts to pick up. That's where we get things like Masks of Nyarlathotep. We got a number of absolutely awesome source books like Arkham Unveiled and the Miskatonic series. You got a number of really good scenario books, as I said, and a lot of source books that came out, which I'm going to touch on shortly. And over time, the game has got better and better. One of the things that they've done is 1920s isn't always a desirable or well-known era for some people. So there were two and a bit source books to add on to the game. One was called Cthulhu by Gaslight, which let you play Victorian London. I have run that on a few occasions. It's not one of the best source books I've ever done. In fact, there's a fairly lengthy scenario in the back that has characters working with Sherlock Holmes' younger brother, Mycroft. I think it's Mycroft. It's a nice setting, but it's not the most serious, not like 1920s. But it does have some really cool sort of scenarios that they put out for it. I remember one that involved giant Sumatran rats and odd things like that. It was, the other one they did, they changed the name of it. It was originally called Cthulhu Now, and it let you play in the 1980s. I always found that it didn't really work, and even when you kind of transcribe the game to a modern setting, which I think they did. I can't remember if it was Chaosium, but I believe there was a modern, I can't think of the name of it now, it's gone out of my head, but there was a modern version that was basically a game in its own right. It'll come to me in a minute, I'm sure. But modern Cthulhu doesn't quite work. When you've got things like cell phones and the internet, Google, and things like that, it takes away a lot of the mystique. A lot of the enjoyment from 1920s Call of Cthulhu is the investigation. And that means libraries and talking to people. When you can just try and Google something, it takes a lot of the fun out of it. So I don't really recommend the modern take on it. The game does have I think, as much as I'm a fan of H.P. Lovecraft and I love his work, I think the game does suffer in its use slightly. And that's because once you have played several scenarios or you've played a campaign, you know as a player, assuming you didn't anyway, you know what's going to happen. You know how it works. You kind of lose a lot of the mystique behind the Cthulhu mythos. And it almost does become a Monster of the Week show. Which is a shame because it is an absolutely awesome game. But that is its one negative, I think. I kind of get round this in mind a little bit. I did try and run a 10-year in-game campaign using all the decent scenarios I had at the time. And we got about halfway through before it kind of broke down due to various reasons. I don't run it as particularly lethal like it's supposed to be. I try not to drive the characters too insane. After all, you want the same characters. If you've got to try and introduce new characters, it doesn't quite work. Because suddenly you've got to go through the whole rigmarole of role-playing that again, and you could just be getting on with it with the characters you've got. But also, I find if you try and turn the mythos into something that is still true to its nature, but plays out more like more modern paranormal approach, it's probably the easiest way to put it, like you might see in Hollywood movies or TV, then it kind of works a bit better. If you keep the mystique, but you still point out that these are extra-dimensional beings and the like, or things hidden deep under the ground, or you try and keep to the mystique that these are godlike beings, as opposed to just alien or other dimensional entities of power, I find the game kind of works a lot better. I think that's just down to the fact that Lovecraft's writing was very suitable for his time, but not so much for ours. So that's generally Call of Cthulhu. Hopefully I am selling it really well because it is a really good game. There are certain things I would try and get your hands on though, if I was you, if you were going to try and run it. The rulebook is perfectly acceptable to run it with. You'll have everything you need in there. You'll have the creatures, the spells, the character creation rules, everything. But there are certain other books that I've pretty much slowly cleared out my collection, and I've kept these books. In addition to the rulebook, there were a couple of books put out in the early 90s called The Investigator's Companions. And I think Volume 1 was a book of professions. So as I said, the rulebook has about a dozen professions. This gave you like 60, 70. This opened up, so you could play anything really. It's got things like baseball player, grave digger, mortician, aviation pilot, sailor, construction worker. It opens up a lot more variety in your characters, and you can play everyday bonds. It's not an essential, but I would see if you can get hold of a copy of that book. Second book, which I would really get, is called the Malleus Monstrorum. I'll double check that now. Which is essentially the bestiary, and it's collected all of the creatures from like 90% of the books, and it's all put them in one thing. And that gives you a lot of more variety for your scenarios and for your options. It keeps it different game after game. They did a book called Arkham Unveiled. Arkham being the primary town that Lovecraft set his stories in. They did a whole series of these books. Arkham, Dunwich, Kingsport, Innsmouth. But as a lot of scenarios are set around or in Arkham, it's worth trying to find a copy of that book. Other ones if you really want them, but you can kind of blag everything else. The last two books I would try and get your hands on is a copy of Dreamlands. Dreamlands was the other setting source book that I mentioned earlier, in a way, because you can either use it as an add-on to the actual game, or you can play a Dreamlands campaign. So you are not playing your real selves, you're playing your dream selves in a fantastical environment that is still heavily influenced by the mythos and its machinations of its gods. And I think it's worth getting hold of that book. Lastly, I mentioned Masks of Nyarlathotep as a campaign. I can think of a couple of campaigns that they've done in the past, but Masks of Nyarlathotep is the best one. It's a global campaign taking you from New York, I won't spoil it, all around the world, trying to thwart the goals of one of the ancient gods. I really recommend getting hold of that, even if you just pick up the rulebook otherwise. Okay, I've been waffling for a quarter of an hour now. That's an awful long time to be talking. So I'm going to leave it at that. If you've got any comments, questions, experiences with the game, you agree or disagree with what I've said, pop it in the comments. We'll have a bit of a chat. Otherwise, I hope this has been interesting or useful. Until next time, I'll pick another game that I have played and talk about it. Until then, take care, guys, and good gaming.